it's Michael.
And I'm Carter.
And this is the second episode of Hammercircuit. Today we're going to be talking about human rights and the expansions of it. So today's agenda, a little bit in more depth, we're going to be talking about human rights, like what is human rights, what plays into it, certain views of human rights
who qualifies for them and such.
By certain philosophers. And then after that, we're going to be talking about how does that relate to the current artificial intelligence and robotic revolution. Like, how does that play in? When should robots or AIs get human rights or some sort of rights in that regard?
We get it. So I'll just hop right on into it. So if you go to colearning.net, this is where we get kind of an in-depth explanation of human rights and such. So this is a direct quote from it. Quote, "At the root of human rights concept is the idea that all people should be able to live with dignity." End quote. Which brings up the concept. So, what is dignity in that sense?
Yeah, so, what is it? One person tries to place a definition on it, and her name is Donna Hicks. She has a PhD as well.
Yeah, and just to tell you a little bit more about Donna Hicks, she's written about dignity. She has an entire book on it. It's Dignity, the essential role it plays in resolving conflict. She has a TED Talk as well, so feel free to check that out.
So it can kind of be argued that she's sort of an expert or at least knowledgeable in what she thinks or what is believed to be dignity. And the way that she defines dignity in one of the articles is that dignity is our inherent value and worth as human beings.
Right. And it really starts to break down the question. The first question I have when she brings that up, why necessarily do we deserve our inherent value? Where do we get this inherent value?
And inherent value, I guess, why do we deserve it? I think it's just a collective interest in that if a person doesn't get an inherent value, certain emotions bubble up and it can lead to lots of conflict. And over the past few years, we kind of just don't really want to have as many conflicts as we used to. There are some main conflicts right now, but not as much as we used to have hundreds of years back. Yeah. And
I think the way that Donna is really describing the inherent value, she's using it in two terms. She's using it in the sense of individuals. How does an individual find worth in themselves? But then as far as human rights go, human rights is relating dignity more to how do all humans universally have this sense of dignity? How do we find inherent value in humans to where they have these human rights, to where they can live with their inherent value?
And she's using the word value. So different people have different values. So she's saying inherent value. So how do we find out what the inherent values of humans are on a universal basis? Do we
exactly?
Do we raise a human in a controlled environment and expose them to the world after they're 18 and see what the response is and what do they find as aligning with their values and their worth? What do we how do we make it a universal thing?
Exactly, and it's very difficult to find that universal thing because there's so many oddballs in society, right? Think about it. There's so many different people that act differently on a consistent basis. And how do you find, what is the universal standard for value and worth?
And adding on to that, the brain isn't a consistent thing. Every person, their brain is shaped by their experiences and minor differences on a chemical basis, on a biological basis, on a genetic basis as well. Another thing is that value and worth is built up in certain humans, or in most humans, by respect. And the quote that Donna Hicks says about respect is that respect, on the other hand, is earned through one's actions. In different societies, certain actions elicit a positive or negative response in respect. So they'll either gain or lose respect based off their actions. So in one society, say the Soviet Union or something, saying that communism is bad or something, you'll lose respect. But if you say that in American society, you'll gain respect. So
exactly, and it brings up, how do we find this universal inherent value when all of our societies and people all have their own definition of what is valuable. And it's an issue because a lot of this is backed up with some of the philosophy that ancient philosophers, or even like a little bit more of a modern day philosopher, how they would think about this. So Plato, he argued that this like right is universal. There is no bar to qualify for these rights in the first place. That's a lot of the thinking is backed up. That's what colearning.net, they use Plato as an example, that there is no bar for this. Everybody qualifies, all humans qualify for human rights and such.
Another philosopher, and we discovered this also on colearning.net, he's by the name by Kant. He argued that human rights is based off the fundamental moral right to be treated as an end in oneself. Basically, he's saying that it's because of the ability for humans to reason that, and we reason at such a high and powerful way.
Yeah, we have a high level of consciousness.
Right. That we're special enough to deserve these human rights, basically.
Yeah, he's saying that, yeah, that's perfectly explained. But it brings up an issue because Kant, what he's doing is he's finding actual things or attributes of people to measure why we deserve human rights, why we are different from everything else on the planet, why we deserve to live with dignity. When Plato, he argues that everybody qualifies for it without actually giving an example.
So, like, Plato isn't even worrying about it qualitatively or quantitatively, while Kant, he's kind of looking at it at a more of a qualitative way, is that, you know, we have, like, one of the best, like, brains on the planet as far as other species are concerned, and we just have really high reasoning capabilities. However, the thing is that reasoning in humans, like, we define it by maybe IQ or, like, some other metrics, but the reasoning in humans is variable to a certain degree. Some humans are really good at reasoning, you know, and they reason at a very high level, while others, they don't reason as much, or they just spend less time having to reason, basically. It really depends on what stuff they go through life and how they treat life.
Right. And but this brings up an issue. They're contradicting in a way, because Kant is saying that these attributes are what make us human. Plato says that there is no attributes required to make us a human. And if we're going by Kant's definition, which is far more driven by logic and reasoning, Plato just takes it as a given. If we go by Kant, there's some humans that don't meet the bar that he's setting. You know what I'm saying? Like, would you take a human, if you took an example, if somebody had a learning disability, they're not going to have the same level of consciousness as someone with an average IQ. You know what I'm saying? So,
and that's just like, I mean, that's just something that you can measure. You know, you can measure brain activity, and you can see that different humans, depending on circumstances and what happened to their brain, they're going to reason differently. Like, if they're under the influence of a drug, such as alcohol, their reasoning capabilities is going to be very, very stunted. Exactly. So, Kant, it seems that he might be arguing for some sort of threshold on, because he's saying a high level of reasoning, you know. However, Plato, he's not really arguing for a threshold. You know, the fact that we're human, it seems to be enough for Plato, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we saw in colearning.net is that the reason why human rights exist is that they exist as a level of moral duties that we owe to each other as reasoning beings, which also seems to lean more towards Kant's philosophy that we're high functioning reasoning human beings.
But then it brings up the exceptions. If there are these exceptions right here, and they don't meet the consciousness level of, like, where the bar would be set by Kant's standards. Like, let's say somebody's consciousness level as a human was at the same level of, let's say, a cow. All right? Would that qualify the cow for human rights? Well, obviously not. But would that qualify the human for human rights? Well, by Kant's standards, no. But by Plato's standards,
yes.
You know what I'm saying?
And I think the interesting thing about the moral duties aspect of what they're saying about human rights is that not everybody has like the same amount of morality, and some people just only care about their group or their tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you put that in? How do you apply that to the tribes even in Africa that we don't really interact with, whose morals only really pertain to their own tribe, and they're going to protect their tribe at all
how are
costs?
we going to enforce that? That's like another thing, especially since what we talked about earlier. People have different values and different definitions of what respect is. People have these differences culturally, regionally. We get that. So how could we possibly take universal... how could we possibly deem this as a virtue that should be universal to all when we're so different depending on our cultures?
And the thing about universal human rights, which is established by the United Nations, is that the United Nations does not include all the groups of people in the entire world. There are groups of people who are not necessarily represented in the United Nations. Yet, what I see that it means is that the universal law of human rights, that only pertains, or that's only enforced by all the nations inside the United Nations. Mm-hmm. So there are certain nations and areas that those rights are not necessarily enforced. Another interesting thing that we came across is that there's apparently two sets of principles when it comes to human rights.
Yeah, there's two sets that derive the human rights, like two sets of principles, and there are natural law principles, and then there's positive law principles.
So do you want to explain what natural law principles are?
Yeah, I think I can do that pretty well. In a nutshell, it comes from moral principles that all humans kind of have in common. It implies that it's universal, which is what Plato was arguing for. But then Kant believes that this, like, what makes us special is our capability to reason. And he said this is one of his quotes. Quote, "What makes us special is our reason, and our treatment should be determined by the principles of pure reason." End quote. So he's saying that this is deriving from reason rather than what Plato kind of states, implying that it's just universal. So he believes that this kind of just comes from what we all feel universally as humans, but then, as we said before, that's contradicting because we don't all feel the same. Would you like to explain the positive law principles?
So the positive law principles is the other set of principles, and it's mostly that positive law is defined as like a man-made law, and it's instead of the moral principles, it's more or less created by governments, and it's responsive to the needs of the state. So it's more of like a collective saying, like, we think that collectively as a society this is going to benefit everybody if these rights are put in place. So the rights in like positive law are considered freedoms or protections which are written down usually as statutes, and they're mostly legally enforceable by the government. So, I mean, that's kind of like the law part of it. And then the thing about the positivism enforced by governments is that they deny the existence of natural law, you mean like basically the moral part, and it accepts that only the justice is implied in the law of the state. So more or less like the collective thing, like the state. And it can't really be determined by rational or spiritual principles. So basically, it goes against natural law principles because that one's kind of based off of pure reason, while the law one it's not looking at the rational or spiritual one. It's just looking at what's more or less beneficial to the state.
Right. So, and you see the differences between that. You see it kind of almost deriving from the Kant mindset where it's reason, and then the Plato mindset where it's kind of just we're going to give this to you as a given. And you see this as well in the actual rights themselves. Like, I'm not sure if we wanted to read the rights off or not.
I mean, it's a lot.
It's a lot. So we could like name a few as an example later on. Like if we just were to quickly look at it right here. No slavery. No slavery is that's number 4 as a right, and that's like a practical thing. Like that's kind of a practical thing that we can just derive from reason. But then there's number 5, which follows it, which is no torture. And no torture, there could be exceptions made for that. Like if you were to have a terrorist in custody and they have planned out a terrorist attack and we need information from them. thousands of people are going to die if this person does not reveal the information about the terrorist attack, but he won't tell anything. Are you really not allowed to pull out a few fingernails? Or, I know it sounds awful and brutal, but are you really not allowed to do anything necessary to get that information?
And here's the thing, is that it's either, I mean, the pain of one person versus the death of thousands potentially. You know, when you look at it that way, like, torture seems like the most logical option.
It seems like a more moral action to take.
It's a cold, logical, like, thing to think about, but like you could potentially be saving the lives of thousands, depending on how dangerous this potential. And this is all hypothetical, but like, if it's a terrorist and you know it could cause a lot more harm if you don't do anything about it, you want to do what's best.
So,
and that's
what Michael's getting at here is, are you going to take the Plato approach where you just say, nope, he's a human, he qualifies it despite what he's doing or what his agenda is, he qualifies for these rights, ergo, right number 5 of universal human rights, he's guaranteed it? Or are you going to take the Kant point of view where you say, there's these things that you have to qualify for, and if you don't qualify for it, we can't necessarily promise you those rights.
It's kind of saying that if you're trying to break the rights of other humans, then you're basically risking your own human rights to be not respected.
Right. But then there's like the United Nations. We're about to talk about that next. And like things they do to ensure these human rights. Would you like to just read off some of the stuff they do?
So certain stuff they do is like just sustainable development, like helping the environment and refugees, like just protecting them and stuff, relief of disasters, counterterrorism, disarmament and non-proliferation, so like making sure there's like not a bunch of nukes and stuff like that, promoting democracy, human rights, gender equality, and the advancement of women. So, you know, like basically trying to eliminate oppression in the world, governance and economic social development, so just overall like making sure everybody's in like a good standing, health, clearing landmines, because like there's still landmines from I think World War II or something, right?
Yeah, there's recently with the Cambodian genocide and the Khmer Rouge, I think that's how you pronounce their name, the Communist Party of Cambodia, they still have landmines around Cambodia after that, like up until this very day, and the UN helps a lot with that.
So, I mean, to kind of sum it up, the UN is just, they try to make sure that the whole world, or like the whole society or humanity, they're all like in good standing and they're all doing well. So like nobody's like starving or like on the verge of like getting killed by a terrorist attack type of thing.
Right.
And they're also kind of really best known for peacekeeping, building peace, and just making the world, as I said before, just making the world a lot safer and a better place for this generation of people and the next generation.
Right, but then it brings up kind of a point. We're talking about the limitations and expansions, in a way, of human rights, like we talked about that in the very beginning. That's like what we're discussing today. Well, the question I have is, at what point are some of these just human rights taken as a given, like what Plato argues for? At what point is that hindering us? Because you look at the Rwandan genocide, for instance. Mm-hmm. The UN was so hesitant to dig their hands into the Rwandan genocide. Because,
and like not everybody knows about that genocide, so could you give us more details about it?
Yeah, of course. In a nutshell, there was the mass slaughter of an ethnic group inside of Rwanda. The Tutsis were slaughtered by the Hutus, and the Tutsis were a minority. The UN had peacekeepers in the country, but they were ordered not to shoot at the Hutus slaughtering the Tutsis, and they were also ordered not to have any dig their hands into the conflict and try to prevent it.
So it's the death of a few versus the death of a lot more.
Exactly. And I feel I'm not positive about this, but something tells me that because they're trying to uphold these human rights that are just based on a given, they're not allowed to take actions for the benefit of a greater group, rather for the sacrifice of a few people.
And that leads to a perfect transition to the next thing we're talking about, is that how are these human rights going to have to change in the future, considering the fact that there's the current AI and robot revolution. I guess you could argue that it's maybe the second one, because there's always like these artificial intelligence like winters where there's not much development, but like
there's a huge breakthrough.
But like right now, we're making a lot of progress, and it's really interesting. So with robots and artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence is advancing a lot. Like we're getting like self-driving cars, and those are getting better. We're getting really, really effective facial recognition and stuff. And
we have those robots that look real. They actually have
like they can like simulate facial expressions and stuff. So at some point, like all these like separate applications, they're gonna probably combine together for like one thing that's really good at just applying all these things. At some point, it might be hard to differentiate between if it is simulated consciousness or real consciousness. So one of the questions I was thinking about is like, to what point do we give a robot or artificial intelligence, or Android for that matter, like rights? What do you think?
That's really interesting because it brings up the question. We are giving the rights for dignity, preserving dignity. Well, dignity for a human may be very different from like dignity to a robot. How do you differentiate the dignity? I feel in a way it's to prevent a lot of pain, but you would have to give them the ability to feel pain. Exactly. Would they feel, with their consciousness, would they feel emotional pain?
So the thing we have to ask ourselves, when we're making these robots, we're making these like things that are supposed to automate tasks or able to do things so humans don't have to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do we have two separate classes of robot? One that is robots given with certain human traits, and then ones that are just completely like automated. They can do whatever. They just can't interact with humans in a negative way. So it's more or less, you can do whatever you want, robot. We're not going to give you the ability to feel pain, but we're going to make it where you cannot interact with us and trespass and violate our human rights.
Right. So I think what we're getting at here is it'll get to the point where we are forced to give them some form of rights, but it wouldn't be the same as human rights.
Yeah, and I mean, for the human rights perspective, like maybe we could, but then you would have to give robots human traits as well, or human like what certain parts of certain biological components that make us human. For example, some emotions can be defined as just like chemical like transports and like reactions in the brain,
Right.
For example, there's the one thing called the hug chemical, or like the love hormone chemical, and it's called oxytocin, right?
Right.
And that is generated in the brain through like hugging people, like kissing, like calling, that type of stuff. A robot doesn't necessarily have chemicals. It's mostly just electrical signals of ones and zeros. So when they hug a human, are they gonna really feel oxytocin, and is it really gonna affect them? No. Can we simulate oxytocin in the brain? Can we say, well, if you do this human interaction, have your thought process altered in a certain way? Or another one, which adds natural parts to a robot, do we give robots the ability or machinery to synthesize their own chemicals, that when they react with the environment, it alters their thought process, as in kind of making it where it's like a hybrid machine type of thing, like not necessarily human, but not necessarily robotic.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and it makes some really good points, because what we're trying to do at that point is to make it so they feel emotion, and make it so they have an actual physical presence in our environment. But the issue would be if we're actually going to give them rights, like freedom to move is a right. Like that's quoted from the UN. Freedom to move. We all have the right to go where we wish, where we want to in our own country, and to travel as we wish. Well, if they occupy a physical presence where they might want to actually move, they emotionally decide, I want to move my physical body around this country just because I can, would we have to give them that right because they determined it themselves?
So the thing is like, do we give them rights as soon as they have the ability to like occupy a physical presence and like do stuff? For example, one of the human rights is like right to trial, right? You know, you put to trial if like you break something, right? Or like you break a law. If it's an AI and they don't have a physical presence, you know, you can't put them to trial because they can't be necessarily represented in court, because they could just, you know, escape, as in like they could just propagate themselves throughout the internet or something, you know, or so that type of thing. So kind of something to mitigate that is like, do we just want to stop that from happening? Do we want to put those fail-safes in? Do we even want to build stuff that by themselves can advance to such a point where they don't really need us? And that's kind of where
that's scary in a sense.
It
because
is.
They could very well outcompete us in many aspects. Like if you could say, if they could create something. Well, if you owned a robot, this brings up a good debate. If you owned a robot and your robot made a piece of art better than any other human could do, well, that's your robot. Ergo, would that make it your art? But the robot did it on its own free will, and it's beautiful.
That's kind of, and it's interesting because that's kind of like slavery. It's like, slavery is bad. I condemn it. You know, I'm guessing you condemn it as well. Of course. If you're, and this is just hypothetical, if your slave makes a piece of art, since you own the slave, I mean, this is just past thinking. Since you own the slave, do you own the art type of thing?
Well, if you like have the master mindset, then yeah, it would be, but it really makes you think, because it's doing the same to the robot, and it's not like it has a low level of consciousness at the point that we're talking about where it can make art. It's not like it's a cow or
it's like
a
making
chicken.
art. It's making art that is indistinguishable from something that a human would be able to produce.
Right. You can tell it doesn't have the consciousness of a cow or chicken. It has the consciousness of us, possibly higher at that point.
Right. And so some people like argue that we should just like put fail-safes in, or just like some are just anti-artificial intelligence, and they just don't think we should try to get to a point where they can advance themselves. And I think one like alternative route that we could take, which might be better and might just help humanity advance and not make them obsolete, is human-computer symbiosis. There's like we learned in biology class a couple weeks back that there are 3 types of symbiosis. There's mutual, commensal, and parasitic. You know, if we let robots advance to a point where they don't need us, it could turn into a parasitic symbiotic relationship where the robots are turning us into maybe the slaves, or they're forcing us to do things and we don't get any benefit. There's commensal, where, I mean, one of them is like using the other, but it's not really helping the other one. And then there's
but it's
mutual.
Not hurting them.
It's not hurting. And then there's mutual. For human-computer symbiosis, I'm guessing we wouldn't make the computer aspect of it feel emotion, so it's more of like a like from a biological perspective, I guess it would be more or less commensal.
Or even parasitic.
Or even parasitic nature. Because we're harming the computer, we're like using it, we're making it use resources on us.
But if it had the emotion we're talking about earlier, we'd want it to be commensalism, because we don't necessarily want to hurt them, but we want them to be doing things in our favor.
I mean, I guess we can just simply argue that it's mutual, because we're going to be, since it might be connected to us, we're going to keep it alive by feeding it electricity or something, right? So let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just keep it as mutual, because I mean, that's the one that we know the most, right?
Right.
So in the future, and in like pop culture and like sci-fi films, the closest, or like the really like quick wire, like, or quick communication human-computer symbiosis is hopefully having a like processor chip implanted into our brains. And what this will do is that, you know, you're taking a test, or you're having a discussion, or like you're a lawyer, for example, and you're trying to defend a human, right? You could find all the past cases within possibly the instant that relate to the defendant that you're defending, and you could say, given that instance, and it would save lots of time, you could say, like, you wouldn't even have to take that much time to prepare. You could say, judge or the jury look at these past cases, and you just email all of them instantly, and they get it. They also get it because they'll have the chips in their heads. They'll get all the potential cases, and they'll like be able to watch it within an instant as well. So with a processor embedded in the brain, lots of things can improve. Communication speed, possible telepathy in a way, processing of information, filtering of information. So I mean, that's a bad thing. That could be censorship.
In our last podcast, we discussed like the negatives of what this could be. So we're just going to go off the positives for now,
right,
and such. But one of the negatives that I really see, and what Michael sees as well, is that there could potentially be a technology gap. So, you know how if you're ever talking to an old person and trying to explain technology to them, it's quite frustrating because they don't understand some of the basics of things when it comes to technology. They don't understand their password. They're tortoises, right? Well, if we have humans with chips in their heads and they can do what you just described earlier, where they can find anything instantly, they can process things, blah, 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 you get it. If there's people that can do that almost instantly, and then regular people, they could have a normal IQ, they could have above average IQ, right? Well, those people are going to look like tortoises to the people with the chips in their heads.
Right, exactly. And, I mean, just to elaborate a bit, the human brain, or at least from what I've heard, the human male brain, it finishes developing at age 25. Now, and say you have a hypothetical processor chip that you embed into your brain, that's going to be connecting to all your neurons and stuff. So for somebody who's older than 25, it's going to be very hard for their brain to learn how to communicate and start processing information with a processor, right? Same thing can be said with the elderly and how they have a tough time with technology. Technology was introduced to them maybe when they were 50 or something. So certain new concepts, they just don't make sense because they've grown up with like older traditions and like older ways of doing things.
Right.
So like they'll just think that, well, I mean, I've always used this one and it always worked and stuff, and like using a computer sometimes requires thinking about solving a problem or accessing something in a non-conventional way if you grew up doing it like differently for like, I don't know, 10-20 years. So it's that brain development aspect as well.
Right. And then this is another aspect that adds into it. If you have a chip in your head and you're thinking at this level, and there's a socioeconomics that would just immediately make you think that you're superior to other people without the chip, how do you? Because if we're going back to Kant and what he was stating, that there's a bar for this, there's certain things that you can do, and it's defined by your level of consciousness. If your level of consciousness is that high with the chip, if it's much higher than any other human, you've set the bar a lot higher. If we just ignore what Plato said about it being universal, the bar is a lot higher now with the chip in the head, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the other people, they don't have that level of consciousness because they don't have the chip in their head. Ergo, they don't meet the bar. They're very far under the bar, right? Like, as of right now, a cow to us would be a normal human to the people with the chips in their heads. So if we're ignoring what Plato said, how could they possibly apply the human rights to people?
So, I mean, essentially you're going to have two different bars. Anything below the first bar is not really considered something worth having human rights for. And what we consider for that is, like, animals that are not human. And then you have the second bar, which is the humans with the processor chips in their heads. So, like, I mean, I guess one way I would think of to mitigate it is that you have some sort of mediator that, or some sort of technology that is able to slow down or speed up the reasoning capabilities of even a normal human. So, for example, there's machines that can read alpha waves and stuff. So having some sort of middle technology that can help come to understanding and have basically engineered empathy. So, going into a room, and I mean, there's still going to be differences. So I guess there would be there's going to be rooms with like mediator machines, perhaps. I guess you're going to still have two different societies, but every once in a while they're going to have to come and converge and stuff. So it's kind of like how we have the elderly, but we're not trying to like destroy the old people. Like we're trying to be empathetic and understand where they're coming from. So that's what we're gonna have to do with the process of things. It's gonna be a lot harder because the gap's gonna be a lot bigger, but I think we can pull it off.
I think we could probably pull it off if we did everything that you just said. It would just definitely brings up the question. Perhaps before we consider applying new rights to AI, robots, and this or symbiosis relationship between us and robots, I think first we should maybe consider our own rights first. I'm not disagreeing with the UN and their human rights, because just to name a few of the rights,
the right to life,
like right to life. We have number 2, don't discriminate. Number 4, no slavery. Number 11, we're all innocent until proven guilty. These are practical things that I can get behind.
Like, they all make sense, and
there's some that make a little less sense than others, but overall, we have to start asking the question, coming from a logical point without any givens, how are we going to define ourselves as who's worthy of having rights?
I mean, it's really hard to say. And another thing is that this is not really, I mean, we haven't mentioned it yet, but this is all assuming that like the ethics and stuff isn't going to try to stop us from like trying to reach a higher state of human consciousness, because the ethics community will probably argue like we're going to be on two different playing fields. Some people, it's not like everybody should have equal standing and equal privilege type of thing.
Right. There's like number 1 of the human rights is we are all born equal and free.
But as soon as you get those like symbiosis things, like it's not really equal.
Can you really say that's just delusional at that point? If you're saying that someone at the symbiosis, I'm just going to call them symbiosis humans, if that's all right with you. If the symbiosis humans are operating at a level to where they can process things, Google things instantly in their head because of the chip, there's no possible way you can compare those people and say that they're equal in comparison to the people without the chip, the non-symbiosis humans.
So you're going to have communities, and like even if these communities are going to argue like we can't do this, there's I mean, it's a subculture, but there's a movement of people who are definitely willing to like stick like technology and like internal tech into their bodies, like human experimentation on themselves. There's several cases of that, people putting RFID tags in their in their hands, people putting magnets in their hands, for example. I mean, those are simple things, but even still, like people are eventually going to do it themselves, even if it's not like scientifically or completely safe and sound. People are going to still do it, and you're going to have these special cases of people, even if it is not globally accepted.
Yeah, and you'll see some of the ethnic communities trying to hold it back. Some religious communities are most likely against it. And we see this with CRISPR. You know about CRISPR?
Yeah, I've heard about it. It's like gene editing.
Yeah, it's the gene editing software. There's people against that. There's genetically modified organisms, the GMOs. People are against that. This is a lot bigger than those, and there's going to be a lot of people against it. But I think the way that our society is moving, the general direction in which it is moving, I think it's impossible to avoid the fact that eventually at some point there's going to be symbiosis humans, and we are going to have to determine the rights for those humans.
Right. And I think this kind of leads to possibly the potential next discussion for our podcast, and that is that how does ethics and religion play into the advancement of human civilization?
Yeah, and religion in general into the next episode we could debrief and talk about.
So this was the second episode of Hammercircuit. Me and Carter, we definitely had a great time discussing these issues about human rights and how things are going to be potentially different in the future. I hope you guys liked it as well. Please make sure to maybe like or share or follow us. So see you guys next time.
See ya.